In all the recent public discussions about major social challenges, like the concerning trends in health, vocation, and sense of purpose for men, it's easy to focus on things like education and workforce policy solutions. But are we making a mistake if we ignore the role of things like marriage and family?
That shouldn't have us shy away from the message we should be communicating to young people, and particularly around family formation, education, and religious faith.
On this episode, we sit down with national scholar Ian Rowe to examine the evidence for why involved fathers, especially within married two-parent households, are one of the biggest predictors of flourishing for kids, especially boys and young men. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This year, Sutherland Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary, thanks to all those who support the work we do for Utah and our great nation. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we're joined once again by Beth Akers, Senior Fellow at AEI and contributor here at Defending Ideas. Beth, welcome back.
Hi, Nick. Glad to be back.
I'm excited to dive in again. We've been, having these conversations about issues facing men and boys across a number of different domains. But again, this conversation starts to feel a little bit different. We sit down with Ian Rowe, who's one of your colleagues.
That's right. Colleague and a good
AEI.
friend at American Enterprise Institute. That's right.
And he also, I always try and mention this because I think it's so impactful. He wrote a book called Agency a couple years back, and he also founded Vertex Partnership Academy. So he's kind of a think tanker and an educator practitioner type.
Absolutely. He's like a big thinker and a big doer, which is an unusual combination in this space. So,
and I think it's really helpful to this conversation because we've been kind of exploring the contours of the challenges facing men and boys, and where it feels like kind of we're landing in some respect is this recognition of the data around things like workforce participation and higher ed enrollment and jobs in the economy. It's still really essential to be part of it. But it feels like there's kind of this purpose, meaning, almost lowercase s spiritual component.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah. I mean, those other aspects are important, but we also have a sense of how to affect those things, which I think makes it feel, like a little bit more comfortable. But yeah, we're kind of in this space of we need to figure out purpose for men. And that seems to be a tougher conversation. And I think Ian's contribution is that he's really good at talking about this. He's not necessarily trying to arm politicians with talking points, but he's just kind of giving us real talk about, how to empower young men to be good grown-up men. And it really tackles this question in an important way.
Well, we'll go ahead and play the interview with Ian in just a minute. But I want to ask you, Beth, as our audience gets into listening to this discussion with Ian Rowe, especially for someone who's thinking about this through the lens of sort of a policy agenda, or we as a state, what should we be doing about these issues? What are the kinds of things you think they need to kind of flag, or what can you flag for them so that our audience kind of knows what to pay attention to, that, well, this could actually inform how we address these issues in the state?
I think something that's coming up as a sticky point in this conversation is, where is the government's role here relative to civic society? We talk a bit about institutions and Ian's school being an institution that's formative, but that's kind of coming down to be the crux point of this conversation for us, which is, where does society, institutions, churches, schools, community groups, where do they take over, and where's the role of the government end? And I think a lot of the commentary that Ian gives us in this conversation can really inform that subject.
I think you're right. Well, let's go ahead and dive into our conversation with Ian Rowe on this week's episode of Defending Ideas. Joining us now in the virtual studio is Ian Rowe, of course, a senior fellow with AEI, founder of Vertex Partnership Academy, is an educator and an author of the book Agency. We've talked about that before. Ian, welcome back to Defending Ideas.
I'm so glad to be back, and so glad to see you, Nick, and with Beth, one of my favorite folk.
Oh, thanks. Good to see you too, Ian.
The world of higher education would be less educated if not for your work. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
That's why we appreciate having Beth here for these conversations, to help bring her expertise to make sense of these issues, because they're so important. And this is a conversation we've been having from a number of different angles for a while now, which is why we're so excited to talk to you about this, Ian, that To kind of jump right into the meat of what we want to talk about today, really curious as to your thoughts on kind of evaluating these national conversations and conversations in various states about the issues impacting men and boys. And kind of the first question on my mind for you is, what are we missing? What are some of these national conversations missing that might be essential elements to help understand what's going on and help us move towards better solutions?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, again, thank you for having me on. It's a great honor. And I'd have to say, first of all, I think it's welcome that we are having a national conversation about the crisis facing boys and men. I will say sometimes I think the word crisis is overused. It doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, but we probably could have a call focused on the crisis facing girls and women. And it's not a competition, but sometimes when we bifurcate these things, we're elevating one set of challenges over the other. And the reason I think that's sometimes an issue is that the solution set, there's a lot of overlap. So when we talk about things like the importance of marriage, which we'll talk about, or the importance of faith, those are just two factors that would certainly improve outcomes for boys and girls, men and women. So one thing I'm often a little frustrated by is the kind of, this idea of bifurcating crises. The other thing I think also as it relates to boys and men, a lot of the literature, the clock seems to start ticking after men have become fathers and they're facing struggles, right? So obviously we want better representation opportunities for men when it comes to things like child custody or family law. We're trying to help men recover. That's important. But I think there should be as equal a focus on how do we prevent young men from getting into these situations in the first place. So, as you said, I'm the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, which is a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Bronx. In our school, we teach something called the success sequence, which again, we can get into, but that's information that we think is really crucial for young people in middle and high school to learn so that they avoid the kinds of decisions that I think are the sort of the precursors to the crisis that we now see facing a lot of young men.
Ian, one of the things I love about your approach, and when we've had you out here in Utah in years past for events, and again, I've had you on the podcast talking about your book, Agency, is this analogy of going upstream comes to mind, that there's so much focus, and it's really easy to focus on kind of the current crisis, whether or not that's the right word to your point. But, as Beth mentioned, we look at the data, we look at the trend lines in male workforce participation rates, in engagement in higher ed institutions, and kind of these other various domains of public life. Is it safe to say that if we're kind of waiting, so to speak, to try and understand and address the challenges facing men until they are already pulling back from major institutions of public life, it's in some ways too late, and we need to be going upstream? Is that kind of the right way to think about it, that we need to be having conversations about young boys and what's best for their development and flourishing?
I think that's exactly right. Now, it is always important to say it's never too late, right? So if there is a young man who's, or an older man who's faced challenges, is feeling disillusioned, feels disconnected, is not part of the workforce, there should be some types of supports that we are putting in place to re-engage that community. But the fact is, it's just much harder. It's just much easier to engage young people earlier. So, so what does the data say that informs the environments that makes both young men and again, young women more likely to make the kinds of decisions that lead to more healthy human flourishing over time? Well, there's the Raj Chetty study, which is interesting to me because it's not usually cited in the evidence around boys and men. But Raj Chetty, for many of your listeners, leads something called Opportunity Insights, which is a think and action tank at Harvard that does incredible research on upward mobility. And they did a project essentially called Where is the Land of Opportunity, really trying to understand what are the factors that really determine whether or not a young person from the lowest economic quintile growing up has the highest probability of economic success when they're 30 or more years older. And one of the things they found that there was a neighborhood effect, that if a young person, even if they're growing up in a household, for example, a single parent household, if they live in a neighborhood where there are more married two-parent households in that neighborhood, that young person has a much higher probability of becoming successful themselves in terms of going from the lowest to the highest economic quintile, to seeing role models, to having more positive male mentors, for example, coaches, pastors. And so that's just an example of the kind of neighborhood effect that if we were also to think about that, as much as we think about these things like improved child custody arrangements, sure, but what are the things we should be doing with young people to make it more possible for them to get onto this pathway of healthy relationships, healthy marriages, and then optimally children within marriage?
Ian, I think you're right. I mean, we've had these conversations, a number of them now, and I think they're all kind of leading in this direction to like the sorts of solutions that you're talking about. But it feels like there is some discomfort in having a public discourse that includes the sorts of solutions that you're talking about. I mean, we're not allowed to say you should go get married or you should go to church, or these are challenging levers to push on when it comes to trying to create social change. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, and it's a very fair question, and one that we as leaders who are proponents of healthy marriages, faith formation, we should recognize that sometimes when this message is put out there, it seems like we're moralizing. It seems like we're proselytizing. It seems like we're calling people bad people if, for example, they didn't get married or they had kids outside of marriage. So it's always important to say, for example, that just because a child is born into a single parent household, that's no guarantee that their life is a life of failure, nor frankly is if a child is born into a married two-parent household, is that a guarantee of success for that child. We have to acknowledge these things, that at the end of the day, every kid and their parent, whatever their household, whatever their faith belief system is, has the power to lead a self-determined life. They may just encounter different hurdles. So we have to be honest about those things. That said, we also have to have the courage to talk about the ideal scenario based on data and, frankly, common sense. And here, actually, the social science is pretty powerful, that if you're talking about things like the boy crisis, the girl crisis, being raised in a married two-parent household, the data does say the likelihood of success is far greater. And there's a common sense element to it. You got two parents, you get twice the love, twice the attention, twice the focus. And there is also something to be said about, again, back to the issue of fatherhood. What is it that makes a father into a great father? And again, by saying this is not the only scenario, but hopefully the thing that makes a father a great father is the fact that they first bonded to their spouse. And that relationship became an agreement to then produce children where you now have a mutual force that is supporting a child. Now, again, by saying these things, it's not casting judgment on single parents, because people become single parents for lots of different reasons. And so we always have to carry that. There might be some people reacting in a way that they're turned off because it seems like we're making a moral judgment. And to really advance the ball, I think we have to say that we recognize that we live in a complex society and relationships are difficult, but that shouldn't have us shy away from the message we should be communicating to young people in particular about what are the likely decisions, the likely rewards and consequences associated with different series of life decisions, particularly around family formation, education, and religious faith.
Ian, we need to take a break in just a second. And when we come back, I want to dive into a report that you were a co-author for out of Virginia that talks about some of the stuff in detail. But before we go to break, to really kind of put a fine point on it, I'm thinking about, again, all these conversations we've been having and policymakers at the state level, the national level across the country that are thinking about ways to help address these challenges. And if it's things like looking at the mental health services system, looking at education and workforce policies, and that's all good and necessary, but if we do not include marriage, family stability, faith institutions, those kinds of anchoring aspects of life in the conversation about causes and solutions, are we making a mistake?
Well, I think this is the challenge for most policymakers, people in think tanks, academicians. We can create lots of policy. But the reality is policy has a certain reach into the souls of human beings, into the hearts of people, into the intimate decisions that people make about their own lives, about their relationships, about the children they have, the timing of when they have children. Those are the kinds of things that are affected by morals, we will say it, by virtue. And so policy can only take you so far. And if we don't have the courage to talk about what it means to lead a life of meaning and purpose, then we are missing the boat and frankly, missing out on some of the most powerful forces that do help decision making. And so, yes, policy is important. We'll talk about it more. Things like school choice. That's a great example of a policy effort that creates more opportunities for both more young men and young women to be on an educational, pathway to success. That's great. But there are other things beyond that, sort of technical policy intervention that we also have to have the courage to talk about.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dive into some findings in Virginia from a report that you co-authored, and also some recommendations, some really interesting, kind of striking things there that can help put shape around this. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn with Beth Akers, and we've been talking with Ian Rowe about some of the components that might be missing from the national and state conversations about the challenges facing men and boys. And we're going to jump right back in. But before we continue, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel and click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. You can find all of that and more at defendingideas.org or wherever you like to get your shows. Ian, you kind of teed up some of this before the break, but this idea of these anchoring institutions that increasingly is kind of a theme that as Beth and I talk about this issue with folks, that comes up more and more. And I want to ask specifically because you were a co-author for a new report called Good Fathers, Flourishing Kids, The Importance of Fatherhood in Virginia, and a great roster of scholars that helped contribute to this. First, I kind of want to ask just your high-level takeaways. What are the main findings in that report that we need to be aware of?
Yes, well, it is exciting that Governor Youngkin in Virginia, asked a very diverse team of scholars from Brad Wilcox, Richard Reeves. We had perspectives from the gamut, from more progressive to more conservative. So I actually think it's a very strong report that shows, A, that this is an important issue, regardless of where you land on the political spectrum. And it's also good evidence that more and more governors are stepping back and seeing that if they really want to address a host of issues, education, poverty, crime, mental health, we have to have honest conversations, again, about young boys and men and young girls and women. So this is an example of that report. So some of the key findings, and again, some of these things are not, they're not rocket science in that they're kind of expected, but it's important that the kind of social science catches up to common sense, right? So among some of the findings, we found that boys and girls with involved dads, and in this particular data set, that generally meant having dinner at least 4 times per week with your kids. So that's generally what it meant. But so boys and girls with involved dads in the Commonwealth of Virginia, generally better grades, more A's and B's, less likely to have their parents contacted for disciplinary issues in school, and also very importantly from a mental health perspective, less likely to be depressed. So that kind of makes sense, right? If you're sitting down with your dad on a regular basis each week, hopefully what that means is you're not both on a digital device, completely disconnected from your current reality, but you're having human conversations. You're having human connection. There's someone that cares about you. So often we look for all these like complex policies and complex interventions, when sometimes just presence, engaged presence, makes a huge difference in the quality of life, both for the adult and the kid. So that was one, I think, very important finding: just better grades, less disciplinary issues at school, and less mental health issues, and particularly in terms of depression. There also was actually a pretty powerful, and this one I do think was surprising for some, and I think instructive, is that as related to academic performance, there was no racial divide between Black and white children who were raised in intact families. That's really important, right? So, because there's often this sense that the racial achievement gap is often caused by racial bias, whether it's teachers, schools, or racism in larger society. But our finding in Virginia is that kids raised in intact families, generally married to parent households, no difference in terms of racial outcomes. So that's a very, very, very powerful finding, which for me, once again, underscores this idea. Let's talk a little bit more then about marriage formation or creating a new social norm around marriage as it used to be that marriage was considered what's called the cornerstone in your life, kind of a turning point, a big decision, as opposed to a capstone, meaning something that you might do at the end of your life. And this idea that the cornerstone, meaning that, finishing your education, getting work, getting married, then having children, was kind of the middle class script in our country. And I think these kinds of findings, which showed that there was no no difference in outcomes by race, particularly for kids raised in intact families, that says something about the importance of marriage.
Ian, it seems like the policy conversations we're used to having around these issues are more focused on survival of people, whereas your ideas seem to be about thriving. Do you see that as a distinction?
I do. I don't want our kids just to get by. I run schools and I run schools particularly in low income communities with high crime rates, high non-marital birth rates. But I run schools specifically in those communities because I want them to know that robust, fulfilling lives are within their grasp too, and that there are pathways to get there. Those pathways typically include things like getting a great education, some kind of full-time work. It usually means forming a strong family. I mean, one of the things we say is very important to our students is that it's not necessarily about the family that you're from. It's about the family that you're on the pathway to form. That can make a huge difference in your life. And these are the ingredients of human flourishing. And if you throw in there, by the way, a mix of religious faith, it can be a game changer. And so, yes, I want our students to thrive. I want young people across the country to know the ingredients of what a fulfilling life can be.
Ian, there's a section of that report from Virginia. I want to read this briefly and ask you to expand on it a little bit, because I think it helps to put a ribbon around, if you will, these findings of the importance of marriage, family formation, kind of the family stability aspect and their influence on young people, in particular men. And the section from your report is this: the challenges facing men are now a well-documented phenomenon. Increased deaths of despair, declines in college attendance, and high rates of male disengagement from full-time work are just 3 indicators of the problems that men face today. These challenges merit our concern not only because they hurt adult men, but also because they make life difficult for the women and children in the lives of men. That's because when men flounder, they are less likely to be the fathers and family men they could and should be. So I want to ask you to put that quote from the paper in context of what, and you've kind of alluded to it, but when we're talking about issues facing men and boys and wanting to fix those issues, there's kind of a societal ripple effect that there's outsized benefits for everyone, as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described, I think the last sentence was that those men are now less likely to become the fathers and the responsible human beings that we're wanting to. All that's saying is that's the cycle of disadvantage. That's the cycle of deprivation that occurs if we're the examples that are quoted in that, the suicide rate, the deaths of despair, all those things, almost all of those are the culmination. Those things don't just happen, right? That's what I mean when we seem to focus our attention on the sort of the most extreme examples when men are older. Well, what happened to those men across the first 10, 20, 30, 40 years of their lives, where they thought that alcohol, drugs, suicide were the only way to solve their problem? And so if we really want to break this cycle, again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to figure out how to help a 45-year-old man who's feeling disconnected, and there are things that we can do there for sure. But how do we shift those attitudes and behaviors early? It's one of the reasons we even have a campaign. One of the recommendations we make in the report is that there should be PSA campaigns. I used to work at MTV, in a former life, where I ran all of our pro-social programming around, getting young people to vote, to practice safe sex, to support preserving the environment. And I saw the power of really well done media messaging. And right now, for many young people, they're not seeing marriage, for example, as a necessary component of their own lives. And what if we were to have more campaigns, not waiting until the deaths of despair occur, but when young people are far more receptive to these kinds of messages, again, to stay off of this path of decision making, which right now is leading too many young men and then older men to fall into those statistics that you just mentioned.
Ian, we need to take one quick break. When we come back, I want to dive into recommendations, sort of ask you if you're advising folks in Utah and other states, even at the national level, what are the things that we should do, either from a public policy or kind of a civic institution and culture standpoint? And there's some great recommendations in this report that I want to ask you about. And also, maybe we can talk about some broader things you would recommend as well. So let's get into kind of the solutions conversation. What do we do about all this in the last segment? We're going to take a very quick break. Again, you're listening to Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn with Beth Akers, and we've been talking with Ian Rowe about some of the challenges facing men and boys in the country today and some different ways to think about it so we can actually move the needle. Before we jump back into the conversation, I want to remind you again, if you like what you're hearing or seeing, please subscribe to Defending Ideas. If you're watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning, and you can subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and subscribe, or find all of this and more at defendingideas.org. Ian, to round out the conversation, I want to focus on, well, what do we do about all this? Because I'm sure there's folks out there listening to this conversation or watching this thinking, this resonates with me. This makes sense. Like, yes, public policy has a role, but there's almost a spiritual, moral component of what men who struggle are missing and need help with. And so I want to focus on, what do we do? What are the recommendations? And in your report from Virginia, there are some concrete recommendations. So maybe just broad question first, what should other states be considering doing to help address these issues?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And I'm glad you started with this kind of the moral dimension of all this, because, and I'll talk through some of the sort of practical recommendations that we made. But it is important, as we've talked about earlier, these issues are as much the matter of the soul and the hearts of people as it is, hard policy recommendations. So, parents that love their kids, there's an aspect of you being the moral shepherd for your kid, pastors, coaches, community leaders, the interpersonal relationships that you have with kids, boys and girls, can make all the difference. And there's no legislation that's going to reach all the way into those, very close relationships. And I just think that it's for all of us, as we think about these issues, never forget the importance of family, mentors, coaches, religious faith, as being kind of our best defense to help young kids see what's really possible in their own lives. And it's not only for young kids, frankly, it's for people of any age, but in particular, those young people still shaping their worldview. In terms of the actual the actual components of things that we recommended, there are a mix of those things that are more targeted towards younger boys to put them on a path, and to older men who are already fathers, and things that we can do. In terms of the things that we can do for younger men, and I'll say in this instance, we practice what I'm about to preach, which is teaching the success sequence in schools. I know in places like Utah, there's already referenda to have this happen. There are a couple of other states, like Tennessee, are actually teaching this content. And for those of your listeners who are not familiar with the success sequence, it's a fancy title, frankly, just for data that says if a young person completes at least a high school degree, so not necessarily even college, but at least a high school degree, then they get a full-time job of any kind, So they learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if they have children, marriage first. That series of decisions, education, work, marriage, then children, millennials who follow that series of decisions, 97% avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. And so we think that that's just crucial information that young people deserve to know and be taught. I mean, the schools I lead are in the Soundview section of the Bronx. The non-marital birth rate is 85%. So nearly 9 in 10 babies are born outside of marriage. So our students aren't seeing a lot of examples of people who followed this particular sequence. And so we think it's very, very important to let young people know. And of course, it's 97% avoidance of poverty. It's not 100%. There's no guarantee in life, right? But what are the likely rewards or consequences associated with different series of life decisions? And we want young people to know that. The other thing that I think that's important, that was also in the report, is that the second component of the success sequence, so there's education and then there's work. When it comes to work, one of the things we're finding, and again, we do this at our own high school in the Bronx, is that we've created multiple pathways so that a student can pursue apprenticeships in high school. So right now, at the end of sophomore year, our students can choose biomedical science, computer science / cybersecurity, or early childhood development / Montessori. So our juniors and seniors are now doing real world apprenticeships where once a week they go out. In the case of the early childhood development students, they're actually working in a pre-K Montessori classroom where at the end of their senior year, they will have a credential that could allow them to become an assistant teacher in a Montessori classroom. And the idea is that we want to remove this notion that college has to be the only immediate option after high school. And there's a ton of data that says when students do that, they earn a credential, they earn money for a few years right out of high school. It's not that they never go to college, they actually do, but their completion rates are higher, their level of actually their marriageability is much higher. So as governors are thinking about this, the idea of creating more what I call multiple pathways in secondary education where students can pursue, a traditional high school degree, and they can have apprenticeships or externships that either allow them to earn money or earn experience. But the key is they earn a credential that has labor market value, I think is very, very important. The other thing, I don't think we specified it as much in the report, but school choice actually is fundamental to this whole enterprise. If we really want to have more young kids on a pathway to, all the sort of the passage into young adulthood, we gotta better prepare them. I looked at some data the other day as relates to Black students in 2015. When you look at data, only 18% of Black fourth graders were reading at grade level, according to the National Assessment for Educational Progress. When you looked at that same cohort in 2019 of now Black eighth graders, only 15% were reading at proficiency levels in 2019. And then when you look at that same cohort in 2023, by almost all indicators, less than 20% of Black students were reading at grade level. How can we expect our students to flourish as they enter young adulthood when they're coming out of our K-12 system so unprepared? And I gave you an example just focused on Black students. Across the board, only about 33, 34, 35, 36% of all kids are reading at proficiency levels based on the nation's report card. So there are many, we could have a whole conversation just about that, but certainly one intervention that would help more kids is just giving parents the power to choose a great school for their kids. So those are just some of the recommendations that I think are worth any governor really looking at their state and seeing where do we stack up in these areas.
Ian, some of the other things you mentioned in the report that I want to ask you to expand on a little bit. If I were to just kind of run down the list, you recommend things like making schools more boy-friendly in various ways, creating a positive culture of fatherhood. You mentioned earlier this idea of a PSA campaign around that. You've mentioned limiting access to pornography through things like age verification laws on the tech side. But a couple that I really want to pinpoint, reviving civic efforts to promote pro-social masculinity. And if I can focus on that one for a minute, because here in Utah, Sutherland, we put out a survey of national men to kind of ask questions in these areas, and anywhere from about 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 of American men are struggling in various domains, depending on the nature of the question. But one of the ones that stood out to me the most is this finding in our survey data that about 36% of American men say they're struggling to understand their place in their community, in their society, in broader society. And I think so many of these conversations come back to this purpose, this meaning, this ethereal spiritual thing of what am I supposed to be as a man today? And that these men who struggle feel adrift in that sense. So that stood out to me, this idea of civic efforts to promote pro-social masculinity. So my question for you is, one, what is pro-social masculinity today? And two, how can we leverage civic institutions to restore it?
Wow. How much time do we have? I mean, what's interesting about the question, first of all, it's a very profound question and very topical. And I think one of the challenges is that somehow what I might, now describe as, so pro-social masculinity has somehow been put in the category of toxic masculinity. Like the things that we've expected men to be, providers for their family, or caretakers, just being the man of the house, has somehow been negatively framed. And perhaps it's because you've got some of these really outliers like the Andrew Tates of the world, who really, in my view, go way too far. But somehow that's all been kind of lumped together, where now men think, I don't know, maybe I should just be a womanizer, or I can go on to these dating devices and just swipe, find someone and have transactional relationships with women. So all of these things are, as you mentioned, we do include a recommendation to, address the pornography consumption issue. At the least, can we have age verification issues so that 13-year-old boys aren't seeing very distorted images about what it means to have a relationship with women? So all of those things fall into what I view are toxic masculinity, but we can't let that diminish the importance of what you're calling, quote unquote, pro-social masculinity. And there, I think it's what we've known for eons about being a good father, being a good husband. We often talk about fatherhood, and I wish we had equal conversations about the concept of husbandhood. Because there's a whole thing related to husbandhood that we should really ensure our young men understand before we get to fatherhood. And these were the kinds of things that I think were taken for granted decades ago about, and again, there has to be a way to have this conversation where saying, there were traditional roles for men, there were traditional roles for women, but to have that conversation without implying that somehow we have to go back to the dark ages, right? But that there are ways of being that are healthy, and especially for children to see how grown-ups are behaving. So I would say pro-social masculinity are the tried and true things around, being a good person, being a good man, respecting women. It's almost obvious, but in the absence in our society today, where there's kind of sometimes, I don't know, moral relativism, where there are no absolutes, there are some absolutes around being a good person, being a good father, being a good husband, and taking care of your family. That's the kind of masculinity I hope young men aspire to become.
Well, Ian, we will leave it there just because of time, but these are really important conversations. We're going to keep the dialogue going and keep working with you on this, and so grateful to your time and expertise sharing it with our audience, and for your work on this new paper and everything that you do in your role, elevating these important institutions and relationships and how they can be so formative and supportive for the next generation, and in this context, especially young men and boys. So thank you once again for being with us on Defending Ideas.
No, thank you. It was a great conversation, and I look forward to continuing. These are very important issues. So thank you, Beth. Thank you, Nic.
Once again, Ian Rowe from AEI and Vertex Partnership Academies and the author of Agency. We're going to take a final quick break and leave you some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. When talking about upward mobility in general, or within the specific domain of the health, vocation, and purpose challenges that some men and boys are facing, the conversations you'll most often hear are focused on things like K-12 education policies to help make schools more friendly for boys, enhancing things like colleges and skilled trade pathways as great options for young men to develop skills and land good jobs, maybe paid family leave, a lot of policy ideas that are valuable and worth discussing as part of this effort. But what isn't being talked about enough is the tremendous impact that marriage and family have on young boys' outcomes later in life. In almost every domain of public policy and public life, like educational attainment, employment rates, mental health outcomes, avoidance of poverty, and more, the evidence is overwhelming that growing up with engaged and involved fathers, which tends to happen more often in a married two-parent household, has significant benefits on average, especially for boys. In all of our public conversations about how to address the challenges ailing boys and men, the role of stable, healthy families should be included alongside all the other policy ideas that we've already mentioned. It's a comprehensive approach that is necessary if we hope to really make a difference. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.